Welcome. My name is Lisa Murray. I am the City Historian and I am glad you have joined us today to explore Sydney's history. Today's talk is Sydney Down to the Ground, and our presenter is Rebecca Anderson. Rebecca is the Assistant Curator at the City of Sydney. Along with Margaret Bretheridge, she manages the Civic Collection of art, furnishings, memorabilia, and official gifts. Today, Rebecca is going to take us on a journey through the city, inspired by an artwork in the City of Sydney's Civic Collection. Treasures abound when you cast your eyes to the ground. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Lisa. I wish to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation and their elders past and present, traditional custodians of the unceded country on which I live, learn and create. I acknowledge and respect their custodianship of the land and waters, their continuing culture and contribution they make to the life of our incredible city. I would like to extend my respect to my Aboriginal, Torres Strait and First Nations colleagues and audience members who may be joining us today, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. Art is integral to Aboriginal culture. It is one of the ways stories have been told for generations, and I'm constantly awed and inspired by the works of art in the Civic Collection by First Nations artists that I have the privilege to help display and care for. When I learned the interesting theme of this year's History Week, From the Ground Up, it inspired me to look at the Civic Collection from a completely different angle. The collection comprises items of movable cultural heritage that document the City of Sydney's identity through historical, contemporary and emerging traditions and creative practices. It includes a fantastic array of contemporary and historic objects and artworks that chronicle our ever-evolving city. What interesting objects and artworks did we have in the collection that spoke to this, I asked myself, and how did they relate to one another? It turns out we had lots. Artists have taken the ground on which we stand as inspiration for years, possibly even millennia, creating works of art out of clay, burying objects beneath the soil for cultural reasons, photographing or drawing elements which rest upon the ground, and creating beautiful, intricate works of art to be walked upon for enjoyment and meditative contemplation. An example is the beautifully orchestrated multicoloured artwork on the right, titled Pattern Number 12 by Inner West artist Wayne Hutchins. Wayne's practice is an interesting one. Using his camera, he wanders his local streets and snaps interesting looking twigs and flowers that have fallen onto the pavement. Using clever digital manipulation, he adjusts the colours and multiplies the image, creating an almost kaleidoscopic effect. In this work, we can see the leaves and buds of an angophora, not dissimilar to the ones flowering in the streets of inner Sydney at the moment. As we are stuck in lockdown and unable to travel or show our wonderful collection to you in real life, I thought I would take you on an adventure, drawing inspiration from one of the fantastic contemporary artworks in the Civic Collection, which focuses on the ground beneath our feet and what happens when you follow your feet as they take you on a journey. The artwork is by Karaconji, and it's named the Flâneur, a French term referring to a person who strolls, lounges, or saunters about. It is a brilliantly made animated video drawing on the point of view of a solitary walker following his feet as he winds his way from Darlinghurst through central Sydney to Martin Place and finally Circular Quay. The work conveys the atmosphere of contemporary Sydney life very convincingly, and Alex's in-depth knowledge of the locations represented, gained from his first-hand experience, makes the Flâneur a work which is as historically valuable as it is aesthetically engaging. A still from the video can be seen on the left, but I'd love to share a short clip of it with you now so that you can get a better sense of the work. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for sharing that, Lisa. I haven't been to the city for weeks and I find myself quite nostalgic for the bustling sounds of the CBD. Next, I thought I would share this map of Sydney, published by William Collins Sons & Co Ltd, onto which I've mapped the course of today's tour via the small blue line visible. We started the National Art School in Darlinghurst, then travelled down the hill across William Street into Woolloomooloo, then back up through Surrey Hills and into the city, passing through Hyde Park, and from there down towards the harbour, ending at Circular Quay. I love this small coloured etching. It is so animated with puffs of smoke coming from the steamships and factories, and the rolling hills of the eastern suburbs as yet unbuilt in the background, as well as the bustling economic hub of Darling Harbour in the foreground. We start our wander off in Darlinghurst, said to have been named in honour of Eliza Darling, wife of General Sir Ralph Darling, a British Army officer who served as Governor of New South Wales from 1825 to 1831. Things are quiet around here at the moment with the lockdown, which Governor Darling would probably have approved of, as he was said to be even rather tyrannical, proposing measures to restrict freedom of the press and theatrical entertainment, which earlier governors Hunter and King had banned due to it encouraging nefarious behaviour, such as robbing thespians and theatregoers after they left their homes. But it's still a lovely place to walk for exercise purposes if it's in your 5-kilometre radius. So, what really lies beneath our feet? The image on the bottom left is of Arthur Malcolm Stace in his typical suit and hat by a veteran street artist who goes by the name of Droogie. Droogie has contributed murals to the Bondi Beach graffiti wall since 1884. Stace, or Mr. Eternity as he came to be known, focused his entire practice on the ground, scrawling the word eternity in his notable, elegant hand on the pavements of Darlinghurst and King's Cross between 1932 and 1967. I wonder if you knew that before the streets of Sydney were paved with concrete and bitumen, many of them were lined with wooden blocks. Wood blocking of roads developed in England and America in the 1840s as an alternative to stone cobbles, but had not been successful, probably because of the cold temperatures and high rainfall, which resulted in the blocks being wet and constantly rotting. In Sydney, the technique was embraced enthusiastically, however, and from the 1880s and by 1900, much of the area that encompasses the City of Sydney local government area, from Broadway to Dawes Point and from Darling Harbour to King's Cross, was paved in brick-shaped wooden blocks which were tightly hammered together and covered with a layer of sand to increase grip on the roads. This technique of paving continued to be used up until the 1930s, and my colleague Margaret Betteridge, curator at the city, discovered when researching these objects that a large range of Australian tree species were trialled as woodblocks, including tallowood, spotted gum, blackbutt, white box, and Western Australian jarrah. She also discovered that a second test section had been laid in George Street between Park and Bathurst Streets in 1883. It was analysed 2 years later by bacteriologist J. McGravie Smith, who took samples of the wood, tar, and pitch to cultivate and isolate bacilli and microcilli, and he was able to identify no pathogenic organisms, thankfully. Specifically, he was looking for typhoid and was unable to find it, which was a relief. So the woodblocks were given the all clear. Interestingly, rather than paying for the blocks to be ripped up when repaving the roads in the 1930s and 40s, the council simply poured bitumen on top of the blocks, so hundreds of them still exist beneath the streets and pavements on which we walk today. The wood blocks in the Civic Collection were saved by the curator Margaret Betteridge in 2011 after they were uncovered during a road resurfacing project in Market Lane behind the Queen Victoria building. The image on the top left is a work titled Residual Number 11, Pocket Globe by artist Lisa Jones. This work focuses on Sydney's pavements. It is part of a series of delicately made small paper mache spheres which Lisa constructed, then drew upon with graphite using the cracks and crevices of her local pavement as inspiration. Her spheres appear like globes of the earth, covered by an intricate web of maps and amorphous continent-like shapes. I love the idea that beauty can be construed from something that we think of so mundane, like cracks in the pavement, and that in Lisa's words, it is possible to hold a globe in your pocket. Before we continue down to William Street, I thought I'd draw your attention to the shapely contours of the Gadigal land we are virtually travelling across today. These two 19th century views of Darlinghurst and Woolloomooloo in the Civic Collection by George Roberts and J.S. Prout respectively perfectly illustrate the hills, gullies, waterways and marsh areas underlying the winding streets of our inner city, which have been progressively manipulated and built upon. In the image on the right, you can see a sense of the deep valley of Yarrung Creek, which originally drained down the valley into Woolloomooloo Bay, but was partially filled to create William Street in the 1840s. The hills and slopes of this area were called several different names in the 19th century, with Potts Point named after Joseph Hyde Potts, accountant to the Bank of New South Wales. He bought 11 acres on the point in the early 1800s, somehow sticking to the hilltop, but Woolloomooloo sticking in the valley. This was probably because John Palmer, the Commissionary General who built a house in the valley around 1793, named his property Walla Molla after the valley's Aboriginal name. This brings us to our next stop, the GADIGAL mural in Barnett Lane, Darlinghurst. This amazing collaborative artwork, designed by Sydney artist Jason Wing with the Australian Design Centre's First Nations creative producers Dennis Golding and Lucy Simpson, references both the topographical patterning evident in my previous slide and material culture of Gadigal country. The word Bangawarra, which you can see has been incorporated into the mural, means make or do in Gadigal language. Evidence of material culture exists across the ground of Gadigal country, and just up the road from where we are now, the corner of William and Riley Streets, an archaeological excavation was conducted in 2003 ahead of the building of a large apartment complex. The website Barani, Sydney's Aboriginal History, which provides histories of people, places and events in the City of Sydney local government area that are associated with the histories of Sydney's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, details the findings at this site, including this incredible large stone axe head found 5 metres below the surface, the remains of an Aboriginal campsite and around 400 stone artefacts. Amazingly, this campsite was protected by the silt that actually washed down Yarrung Creek after the valley was partially filled to create William Street, as I mentioned. This mural and the incredible axe head remind me of 2 other works in the Civic Collection. Time Travellers 2 on the left is by Bronwyn Bancroft, a proud Bundjalung woman and artist. In a career spanning over 3 decades, Bronwyn has participated in hundreds of exhibitions, both solo and group shows, with Australia and internationally, as her work is exhibited in galleries around the world and her children's books are held by all good bookshops. Time Travellers 2 is from her 2016 body of work, which was inspired by her family's collection of stone implements, including flakes, axes and spearheads, which were handed down to them by their elders. Like time travellers, these incredible stone tools carry a sense of power with them. Their shape reveals the hands that once held them, uniting past elders and their technology with family in the present. On the right is pictured Empowering Identity, a 2-channel video artwork created in 2018 by Sydney-based Kamilaroi artist Dennis Golding. Dennis pursues a critical view of social, political and cultural representations of Aboriginal Australian history and contemporary experiences. Often referencing science fictional narratives through the visual motif of the cape, he explores relationships between figures of popular culture, such as superheroes and Australian colonial histories. This artwork, which has been shown in the city's libraries, often depicts a gaze. By using this technique, Golding challenges categorical boundaries from Indigenous and non-Indigenous markings of country and experiences led by difference of race, culture, social class, and histories. Diverging slightly from the path of Alex's Flâneur, we loop into Woolloomooloo, following our feet down the leafy avenue to visit the City of Sydney's JUANITA and NIELSEN Community Centre. You may have heard about JUANITA, a high-profile journalist, community activist, and anti-development campaigner recently, as a documentary titled JUANITA, A Family Mystery came out on Tuesday night about her life and devastating disappearance at age 38 in 1975, which was linked to property developers and the King's Cross criminal underworld. JUANITA's feet were planted firmly on the ground, and she is known today as having been a central figure in the showdown between residents and developers, which ultimately resulted in Woolloomooloo being saved from demolition. The properties surrounding the centre were threatened with redevelopment in the years prior to the enactment of New South Wales heritage legislation in the 1970s, and JUANITA was a leading member of the Woolloomooloo Residents Action Group and an avid supporter of the Builders Labourers Federation Green Bans. Groups which contributed to the retention of the historic streetscapes, 19th century terrace buildings, and importantly, the community of the suburb. The city honoured her life's work by naming the vibrant, beautifully refurbished community centre in the heart of Woolloomooloo after her. The image on the right is a bust of JUANITA in the Civic Collection created by Helena Lillywhite and John Gardner as a three-dimensional tribute to the activist. This bust is based on a photograph by David Farrell featuring JUANITA's amazing iconic high beehive-style hairdo, and it now sits on the ground in the centre's entrance foyer. Our next stop is Wemyss Lane in Surrey Hills, where we'll be stopping to look down to the ground and check out the fascinating artwork titled Hear and Echo, developed by Agatha Gosnape during the 20th Biennale of Sydney in 2017. This artwork includes a series of 14 words and phrases which were painted onto the ground and walls of the lane in white. Upon the completion of Hear and Echo, the city was given a physical copy of the publication, visible on the left of this slide, which accompanies Hear and Echo, and this is now in the Civic Collection. This publication is available on the city's public art website, along with a fantastic video which demonstrates the artist's chosen mediums of language and choreography, detailing the work in Wemyss Lane and the series of walks she led during the Sydney Biennale, which were used as an opportunity to question the role of public art and the context and histories into which her work had been placed. I find the text selected for this work so poetic. Physically topped and tailed by the words, a passing instant, it really captures the fleeting, diverse, busy nature of life in our city before the lockdown. I feel somewhat saddened by the knowledge that the work was designed to disappear, but as Agatha says, it is absorbed back into the laneway. It will become grimy and weathered, and it will soon be less visible, in a way, drawn back into the fabric of the city that produced it. We have now reached Hyde Park, which can be seen in this incredible image taken by photographer Francis W. Robertson in 1873 between the gaps in the columns of the newly constructed Sydney Town Hall clock tower. In these two shots, we look east and northeast across Hyde Park. The Pitt Street Congregational Church can be seen along with Sydney Grammar School and the Australian Museum on College Street. There are other images in this series which can be found via the link that's going to be posted in the chat. Hyde Park is Australia's oldest park and one of the most well-known. In 1810, Governor Lachlan Macquarie officially declared the land a public park and ambitiously named the space after London's Hyde Park. I say ambitiously, as our park is only 16 acres, whereas Hyde Park in London measures around 142. One of my favourite things about Hyde Park is the diverse range of public artworks and memorials it contains, some of which I would like to share with you now. Our first stop in Hyde Park is the memorial You Imagine Me, Thou Didst Let Fall by artist Tony Albert, pictured here. After the work was installed, the city were fortunate to bring the following associated objects you can see here into the Civic Collection. The original maquette for the work, the artist's incredible concertina visual arts process diary, and the decorated ceremonial shovel which was used at the unveiling of the memorial. Pictured in the centre is the base of one of the shells which rests partially buried in the ground, on which is written, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always defended their country. Indigenous Australians are known to have served in the state colonial forces before Federation and have proudly carried on the tradition of service. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander diggers experienced the horrors of war on the battlefield and made the ultimate sacrifice. The sad reality for these veterans was the equality in the country they fought to defend remained a distant dream. This memorial on the land of the GADIGAL clan pays tribute to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have defended our country, the unsung heroes, our brothers and sisters, our mates. Moving on to the northern side of the park, we find ourselves at the stately memorial gates built between 1951 and 1954 in honour of British King George V and King George VI. This site was originally designed to solely commemorate the late King George V and intended to be opened in 1952 by King George VI on his planned visit to Australia, but following his sudden death, King George VI, plans were halted, and in 1953 it was decided the gate should contain a joint memorial to both kings. The memorial gate was literally opened on the 5th of February 1954 using the key pictured here, which is in the Civic Collection, by Queen Elizabeth II during her visit to Australia with the Duke of Edinburgh. The design incorporates the mural crown from the City of Sydney's coat of arms, which I'll speak about in a moment. The gates contain a plentiful array of different symbols too. Each side of the gate is different, and if you look down towards the ground, you will notice several interesting features. In the centre are the initials GR, which stands for George Rex, Rex being the title for king in Latin. And if you're an aficionado of Roman history, you will know that the early kings of Rome were titled Rex. The symbols around the outside of each circle relate to each king's individual crests, and above the circle can be seen the shape of the imperial crown. There are actually lots of different types of crowns pictured in heraldry, and they all have different meanings. In this amazing, enormous painting of the young Queen Victoria, which hangs in Sydney Town Hall, 2 different crowns have been featured. Arthur Charles Fox Davies notes in his book, A Complete Guide to Heraldry, that very few people are aware when they speak of the Crown of England that there are actually more than one crown. There is the official crown, the sign and symbol of the sovereigns of England, known by the name of St. Edward's crown, and it is never altered or changed. This crown, which is probably the one sitting next to Queen Victoria, is supposed to be heraldically represented when used for state or official purposes, and is always represented over the royal coat of arms or other insignia, so it is likely this is the crown we can still see in the memorial gates. The second crown is what is known as the imperial state crown. This is the one which is usually worn. The gems sit in a national property, however the crown is usually remade for each successive sovereign. Interestingly, Queen Victoria actually found the state crown really uncomfortable, so she commissioned a 3rd crown paid for at her own expense, which I believe is the one she wears in this painting. This small gold crown, which was entirely covered in diamonds, took the shape of a mural crown, a headpiece representing city walls or towers. I love this painting by George Cobervine, which Margaret Betteridge notes in her book on Sydney Town Hall, is a reproduction of another painting by Franz Xaver Winterhalter, painted in 1859, which hangs in Buckingham Palace. In the image, young Queen Victoria seems to be looking down at us on the ground with a firm, hard stare. She is so often represented in her old age, and I think it's really nice to remember that she reigned for 63 years from the age of 18, during which time she managed to have 8 children and juggle a work-life balance from home, obviously with a little bit of help. As we pass around the gates, we enter the somewhat secret Sandringham Memorial Gardens, and if we continue to look down as we step into the cylindrical sunken terrace garden, we'll find the most beautiful secluded space with a wisteria-covered pergola and a fountain at its centre. The gardens were named after Sandringham House in England, the preferred abode of the visiting Queen's father, as well as the place he had been born and died. The design for Sandringham Memorial Fountain and the gates was awarded to Sydney sculptor LYNDON in partnership with architect Henry Epstein. Little is known about Epstein, but plenty of information exists about Dadswell's fascinating career. He was a highly regarded sculptor and teacher at the National Art School in Darlinghurst, who, during the Second World War, was appointed as the first official Australian war artist. If you cast your eyes to the ground as we near the memorial fountain, you will notice the amazing mosaic inlay. The original plan here for the fountain shows the design for the inlay, into which we can see a selection of Australian animals. See if you can spot how many there are when you're next able to visit. It's now time to move on from Hyde Park and follow our feet onwards into the CBD. These 2 images reflect our theme today. The one on the right is by Louise Whelan, an oral historian and award-winning photographer known for her striking photographs of New Australians. She has exhibited nationally and internationally, And in 2013, she was contracted by the State Library of New South Wales to photograph and record the stories of Sydney's newly arrived migrants and refugees as part of a project named Migration Voices, Oral Histories, which was included in 2019 on the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Register. These interviews and photographs detailed the participants' first impressions of Australia and the process of finding a place in their new communities. Whelan shares, Australia is now one of the world's great multicultural communities, with 1 in 4 Australians being born overseas. My images of both refugees and migrants now calling Australia home bear witness to our country's democratic values by practicing traditions, religious choices, and languages within the law free from discrimination. In 2015, a selection of these photographs was exhibited in a solo exhibition titled African Australians at the City of Sydney's Custom House Library. The image on the left is titled Stitched and Patched by Damien Sherwin, a painter and proficient weaver represented by Studio A, a supported studio based in Sydney that tackles the barriers that artists living with intellectual disability face in assessing conventional education, professional development pathways, and opportunities needed to be successful and renowned visual artists. Damien's work is strong, colourful, bold, and dynamic, often containing grids and deconstructed interpretations of buildings and interiors. I think the work pictured here is fascinating. When seen through the lens of Sydney down to the ground, it reminds me of a grid of streets from an aerial perspective, the individual stitches almost appearing like the footprints of journeying city slickers down on the ground, whizzing back and forth between their offices, the shops, and their commuter routes. Moving into the city, our location can now be found right about where the red pin is on this timber topographical model. This model was made by Surveying and Engineering Council staff in timber from a cast plaster maquette. Interestingly, the contours of the model are really over-exaggerated. The ground slopes and rises a good deal more steeply than in real life. But the placement of the streets is spot on. As such, we think that the model was probably used by council staff as an aid for routing traffic, or perhaps as a general reminder to staff whose jobs required them to know the lay of the land. Next, we come to the corner of Pitt and Spring Streets, just beyond Martin Place, where the iconic 19-metre-tall memorial to the artist William DOBELL is located. This beautifully shiny sculpture by the artist Albert Fielman was commissioned in 1978 after he won the art prize sponsored by the DOBELL Foundation to find a permanent work for Martin Place. We are lucky to have the maquette for this sculpture, pictured on the left in the Civic Collection. Originally installed in Martin Place, as pictured in the centre, it was removed in the 1990s ahead of the Olympics under the lead of then Lord Mayor Sartor, who had never particularly liked the work, known jovially by the public as the Silver Shish Kebab. The loss of the memorial was apparently particularly bemoaned in the 1990s by skateboarders who had established themselves in the heart of our concrete jungle and loved grinding and flipping off the monument's seemingly perfectly designed edges. The work languished for a few years before finding its current resting place. I'm not sure what Flügelman thought of its removal, but he was no doubt disappointed, although he was no stranger to his works disappearing from view. In 1975, his work Tetrahedra, pictured with the artist at the bottom of the screen, famously literally went to the ground. A large 4.5-metre trench was dug and the sculpture was buried in a park in Canberra. Apparently, Bert told the people when asked that if he shared why he had buried the artwork, the whole point would be lost, stating that he wanted people to imagine what is under their feet and dwell upon the artistic merit of how the sculpture was interred. I actually think the DOBELL Memorial sculpture works magically in this much more intimate spot. Its many mirrored surfaces play tricks on the eye, enhancing the small space with a surprising array of ever-changing colours captured and reflected from the city, the sky, surrounding trees, traffic, office buildings, and passers-by. It provides such a wonderful surprise to those who stumble upon it by accident, and I'm sure DOBELL would have much preferred it here. Peering into the almost magic mirror-like chrome finish at street level provides a very DOBELL-like portrait of oneself, which I think the artist would have thought was pretty fantastic. We end our journey at our shining, shimmering harbour at Circular Quay. As many of us no longer have access to the water because of the lockdown, I thought I'd share this one with you to help you imagine it. Pictured here are 3 interesting works from the collection that engaged with this area. A NAIDOC Week banner designed by Lucy Simpson, sketches for Shine, created for the City of Sydney New Year's Eve celebrations by Reg Mombasa, and Opera House by Emily Crockford, another artist represented by Studio A. Each colourful work provides a different perspective on Circular Quay, but I think you would agree that they all accurately reflect the iconic structures and dynamic, sparkling, shining harbour around which our city is based. Thank you for joining me on this talk, on the City of Sydney Civic Collection. I would like to leave you with this stunning work by artist, writer, curator and gardener, Jeff Barkley, titled, Do You Remember My Love?, which is constructed out of an amazing conglomeration of individually created ceramic discs, which he apparently made by taking molds of natural objects found on the ground and architectural details in his home. If the title of Jeff's work was a question, do you remember my love? Then I would probably answer yes. We are living through a really difficult time, but we do remember love. I'm constantly amazed by the acts of love and generosity I witness between friends, families, neighbours and colleagues at the moment. As it is Are You OK Day today, I think it's a good reminder if we need it to reach out if we need the support or offer it if we have the capacity to do so. I'll finish today with an excerpt from a poem titled Love Might Be, which relates, I think, to this work. And the poem's by Candy Royale, who was one of Sydney's most prominent performing writers. Candy held a firm belief too in the power of love to bring about change from the ground up, and I quote, Sometimes I want to retract my words, blind them, swallow them, so they can't enter the atmosphere, add to the negative energy, but instead I say love might be the only reason we exist, the only thing that separates us from monstrous beasts. The end.